In 1979, the United States was still struggling to heal the wounds left after war, while also dealing with constant disturbances along the northern border near Montana. Back then, the country was poor and suffering, with losses and pain beyond measure. Every inch of land, every branch, every blade of grass, and every living person still bore wounds from bombs, bullets, and conflict. Almost every family had someone who had died because of war or fallen on a battlefield filled with smoke and fire. Those who survived understood deeply what it felt like to lose a loved one. Some families had 8 or 9 children, yet lost them all. And no matter how long the parents lived, that grief could never fade. After the war, Stone Creek Village in Idaho had very few young men left alive. Most of the young people had volunteered to go to the front lines and died there. On the day they left, nearly 40 people had gone together, but when they returned, the survivors could be counted on one hand. The loss was already unbearable, yet the village was also bound by an ancient curse. In every generation, every branch and every family line, there would be households haunted by the curse of the returning child spirit. And this had gone on for hundreds of years. According to the old people in the village, the story of the returning child spirit began with an old foreign sorcerer named Victor Chang. In ancient times, foreign occultists would secretly enter the land and set up ritual altars to suppress the energy of villages, hoping the places they cursed would slowly decline and become easier to conquer. As time passed, no one remembered the sorcerer's real name anymore, but his power was said to be great. He specialized in setting up formations and placing spells. Alone, he came to this land and built a small hut behind the mountain, choosing the thickest part of the forest so he could avoid being seen. There, he secretly studied the feng shui of the area. To suppress or break the lifeline of a place, even the most skilled geomancer had to study every mountain crevice and every inch of earth beneath his feet, because each detail could determine the success or failure of the formation. That foreign geomancer hid on this land for 2 full years. At first, no one knew of his presence. Only when he began destroying the land's spiritual lifeline did everything come to light. At that time, nearby villages were greatly affected. The water in the wells dried up within only a few days. Sometimes people felt faint tremors beneath the ground, or sudden rainstorms would fall, and the rainwater pouring down was black like kitchen ash. In those days, there were no modern police or proper law enforcement in that remote place. The foreign man was discovered by the villagers and by a local spiritual master, who realized his intentions and reported him to the authorities. Soldiers arrested the man and locked him in prison. The officials knew that this curse master was a great danger. No one knew what he had done, but all the poultry and livestock near the place where he had lived had dropped dead. The villagers also fell ill one after another, and the crops were destroyed by the poisonous black rains. The village spiritual master requested that the foreign sorcerer be executed later. The local master found the place where the foreign sorcerer had lived and realized that the man's purpose was not simple. He must have been working under someone else's orders, because this land had no personal grudge against him. There was no reason for him to set up such a shocking formation, one that consumed more than half of his lifespan, just to create such a cruel spell. To avoid further trouble, the authorities ordered the foreign man executed. He refused to confess anything. Even when sentenced to death, he kept his mouth shut. After that, he was taken away to be beheaded, but his head was as hard as stone, and no matter how they chopped, it would not come off. Later generations who heard the story thought it sounded absurd, but in truth, that geomancer possessed extraordinary power. In the end, the village spiritual master had to use his own blood to soak the execution blade, then personally cut off the foreign man's head before he finally died. His body was thrown deep into the forest, while his rolling head was tossed into the large river outside the village. Everyone thought the matter had ended there. But things were not that simple. The head of the foreign sorcerer washed ashore, and his ghost returned to torment the villagers. He cursed the land, swearing that its people would lose their descendants for all eternity. Faced with that vicious curse, the village spiritual master used his own life to break it. But after removing only part of the curse, he died mysteriously and unnaturally. The villagers thought everything had settled, but that foreign demon still caused countless families to collapse. Thanks to the village master breaking part of the curse, many households escaped the fate of having children die young. But out of every 10 families, one would still be tortured by the returning child spirit. For generations, the villagers kept searching for powerful masters to remove the curse. But after so many years, no one could fully break that dark spell. From then on, the villagers fearfully called the foreign occultist Demon Mason down. In those days, the land was wide, but the population was small, and with so many children dying young, the village was left mostly with old people. Young women kept becoming pregnant, but the babies born to them died one after another after only a few months. For some reason, the spirits of those dead infants could not reincarnate elsewhere. Instead, they returned again and again to be born into the same families, yet each time they still could not live through a complete human life. Over and over, this made the women in the village both terrified and desperate to have one healthy child. But the curse still existed and could not be broken, so the infant spirits kept returning endlessly, causing many mothers to grow exhausted and die. There was no pattern. Any family struck by the returning child spirit was chosen at random. And no one knew when disaster would fall on the women there. Whenever they became pregnant, they did not dare step outside the house. Children born in that era were also especially difficult to raise, falling sick and crying constantly. Any family unlucky enough to be struck by the returning child spirit would be thrown into chaos, slowly decline, and finally vanish like a candle flame before the wind. Old Thomas Reed had 2 sons, and both had volunteered to go to war. But only one returned after the northern border conflict. His name was Daniel Reed. Before Daniel went to the front, he had married a young woman named Sarah, who was 2 years younger than him, Thomas had lost his wife early and had raised his two sons alone. His eldest son became a fallen soldier and died on the battlefield, causing Thomas unbearable grief that took years to ease, even slightly. After the country was no longer in turmoil, Daniel and Sarah moved back to live with his father. Making Thomas less lonely than before, Sarah was an elementary school teacher, gentle and skillful in the way she treated others, never offending anyone. Daniel was a decent man. After surviving the battlefield and returning home, he knew many families around him had suffered tragedies and lost their main providers, so he was always willing to help others with small tasks that required a man's strength. Daniel and Sarah had lived with Thomas for half a year when Sarah became pregnant. The couple had been separated throughout Daniel's military service, so when Daniel learned that Sarah was carrying his child, he was overjoyed. Neighbors all happily congratulated them, but no one could have expected that the child they had hoped for would be caught in that cursed fate of the returning child spirit. Before Sarah knew she was pregnant, she had a very strange dream. In the dream, she was walking toward the old oak tree at the entrance of the village. The tree trunk was so large that several people would have to join hands to wrap around it. Beneath it lay an abandoned baby on the ground. The baby was blue, stiff, and cold as a pebble. It was already dead. Seeing the tiny child still attached to its umbilical cord made Sarah's heart ache. In pity, she bent down and picked up the poor baby. Crying as she walked, she carried it back to her home, then quietly buried it carefully in a corner of the garden. When she woke with a start, Sarah felt her chest tighten, as if she had truly cried hard, although the feeling was extremely real. It was only a dream, so Sarah told no one. She had no idea that the dream was an omen of the terrible things that would happen in the future. More than a month after that dream, Sarah received the happy news that she was going to become a mother. However, her pregnancy did not go smoothly at all. Before becoming pregnant, Sarah's body had been fairly full and healthy, and although food was poor and work was hard, her skin was still bright, and her round face looked kind and blessed. Yet day after day during the pregnancy, she suffered from severe morning sickness, vomiting, losing sleep, and being unable to eat until the very day she gave birth. It left her thin and haggard, not as healthy as other pregnant women. The worst part was that in those days there was hardly enough rice to eat, and meals were mostly mixed with cassava or potatoes. Whenever Sarah smelled those foods, she felt sick enough to vomit bile. Thomas felt sorry for his daughter-in-law and his grandchild, but he did not know what else to do. After a difficult wait, the moment of labor finally came. Sarah had a hard birth and suffered through labor for an entire day. The baby's neck was wrapped by the umbilical cord, and when he was brought out of his mother's body, his whole body was blue. Fortunately, both mother and child survived. The baby was a handsome boy with full features. The midwife flicked the soles of his feet several times, and he cried loudly and clearly. When the neighbors heard the newborn's cry, many rushed over, all competing to congratulate Thomas's family. Daniel held his son in his arms with tears in his eyes. The sacred feeling of becoming a father filled him with satisfaction and pride. As the first grandson, the baby was named by Thomas himself. That first grandchild lit a new hope in Thomas's difficult life, and he named the boy Oliver, hoping his life would be successful and always go as he wished. Little Oliver grew quickly, plump and handsome, with rosy white skin and a clean baby scent that made everyone want to hold him. But the older he grew, the stranger he became. Oliver was unusually obedient. All day long, he did not fuss, did not cry, and did not smile. His black eyes simply stared at the ceiling. Sarah often played with him, but sometimes his fixed gaze made goosebumps rise on her skin. Other babies knew how to stretch, kick their legs, and wave their arms. But Sarah's child did not. The baby lay still all day, his limbs soft and limp. Sarah feared he was sick, because at that time many innocent children had been born affected by toxic chemicals left from war. Yet when she gently touched Oliver's arms and legs, he still reacted and pulled them back, so he was not paralyzed. Looking at her child, lying in the cradle like a wax figure, Sarah and Daniel felt their hearts burn with worry, but they did not know what to do. Worse still, the baby often turned blue. Sometimes he suddenly stopped breathing, his body lacking oxygen until his skin darkened like a purple berry, frightening the whole family again and again. Then what had to happen finally happened. On the exact day Oliver turned 3 months old, he died in his sleep. That night, Oliver turned blue as usual. But this time he did not struggle at all. He only lay there staring at his mother. Sarah was sleeping beside him and knew nothing, because the child had not moved, fussed, or cried. At midnight, Sarah woke because her chest was tight with milk. She looked at her tiny son and saw that he had turned blue, his hands and feet stiff, and he was no longer breathing. Sarah screamed madly, waking Daniel and Thomas, but the child had been dead for a long time. Nothing they did could save him. When their son died, Daniel and Sarah collapsed in grief. Sarah kept blaming herself. As a mother, she had not even known that her child had stopped breathing while lying right beside her. At first, Thomas's family only thought their grandson had died young because of illness. The whole family was devastated. Then, 1 year later, Sarah became pregnant again, with both joy and sorrow mixed together. The previous pregnancy had already been exhausting, but this one was even harder. After Oliver's death, Sarah's spirit had collapsed. She was unstable, weak, and reduced to skin and bones. Severe morning sickness tormented her so badly that she could not get out of bed for the entire pregnancy. The symptoms appeared exactly as they had during the previous pregnancy, and the cycle repeated itself. But Sarah did not notice anything unusual. The only difference was the dream that announced the pregnancy. Before the second pregnancy, Sarah dreamed of little Oliver. He looked exactly as he had when alive, with rosy white skin, but his face was dull, and his eyes stared blankly into nowhere. Oliver was lying at the foot of the bed. Suddenly, he sat up and crawled quickly toward his mother. He aimed straight for Sarah's belly and buried his head into it. Then he vanished, as if he had slipped into her womb. Sarah felt no pain. She only felt her belly swell like a balloon. She was so frightened her face turned pale. And she woke with a start, while the sky outside was still dark and the rooster had not yet crowed. About 10 days after that dream, Sarah began vomiting. Every smell frightened her, and her whole body had no strength to do anything. These were clear signs of pregnancy. After an examination, it was confirmed that Sarah was truly pregnant. The child she had lost, had left the young mother with unbearable pain, and the appearance of a second child brought her joy and gave her new motivation to live. After 9 long months of pregnancy, the day of labor finally arrived. This time, Sarah again had a difficult birth, struggling in pain for a long time before the baby was safely delivered. Sarah was so exhausted that she fainted for more than a day. Daniel named the second child Ethan, and he was also a boy. The couple thought Ethan was heaven's compensation for what they had lost, but unexpectedly, the baby showed exactly the same signs as his older brother. All day long, he remained dazed. When he cried, his voice sounded like cloth being torn, and even someone standing at the far end of the road could hear his sharp cries. Sarah was afraid this child would also die young, like the first. So she worried constantly. At night, she did not dare sleep and only watched the baby closely, afraid to leave him. But the second child could not escape fate either. Right after turning 3 months old, he died young from an asthma attack. That midnight, the whole neighborhood was awakened by Sarah's sobbing. It was the night little Ethan passed away. People rushed over and saw the mother sitting curled in the corner of the bed, clutching her tiny blue-faced child tightly in her arms, and everyone felt heartbroken. During the funeral preparation for the child, an elderly woman sat chewing betel in the yard. After hearing the neighbors talk about Sarah's 2 children who had died young, she looked surprised, without saying anything. The old woman hurried into the room where the body was being prepared, looked around, and while no one was paying attention, secretly smeared a black soot mark on the sole of little Ethan's foot. Then she carefully covered his feet with socks, exactly as before, and went outside to sit again. No one noticed what she had done. Even the family knew nothing. The funeral took place normally. Losing 2 children in 2 years made Sarah collapse and grow so haggard that many people could barely recognize her. Her eye sockets sank deep. Her face grew dark, and her hands and feet became thin and dry like chicken claws. The husband and wife grew distant, and a gloomy, cold atmosphere covered the small house. Still, no one noticed anything unusual except that old woman. Sarah began to fear having children, but somehow, half a year later, she became pregnant for the 3rd time. This time, both Sarah and Daniel were terrified, because the couple had barely been intimate for months, so how could Sarah be pregnant? Sarah also never left the house, spending every day shut inside the dark room. Both Thomas and Daniel knew this clearly and sensed something was wrong, but everyone was too afraid to dig into it. After all, another child meant another joy. Who could bear to reject or doubt it? The third birth was again a boy, and he was named Noah. The baby came out without crying. His black eyes were lifeless. Sarah held him in her arms, but the baby neither cried nor smiled. He was cold and indifferent. This time, when the old woman who had marked Ethan's foot heard that Sarah had given birth again, she suddenly came to the house carrying a pig's leg, saying she had come to visit Sarah and the baby. In those days, bringing a pig's leg to visit a woman after birth was a precious gift, because there was normally no meat to eat. Only during the new year would the whole village slaughter one pig together, and each household would receive a small portion to take home and wrap into holiday cakes. Thomas's whole family found the old woman's appearance strange, but since she was a guest, they still received her warmly. The woman was over 70, with white hair, but she was still healthy and clear-minded. After talking with her for a while, Thomas remembered that she was the wife of old Mr. Harper from the village. So people called her Mrs. Harper. Mr. Harper had died more than 30 years earlier. Mrs. Harper had no children. Back then, every child she gave birth to died, and the villagers said she had been struck by the returning child spirit and could not keep her children. Later, for some unknown reason, she never became pregnant again. Her husband also died suddenly, without a clear cause, leaving her to live alone all these years. Mrs. Harper was famously sharp-tempered. She sold vegetables and fish at the market, and no one could bully her or bargain even a penny from her. Yet today, when she came to the house, she spoke very gently. She said she wanted to see the newborn, so Sarah happily handed the baby over for her to hold. Mrs. Harper held the child and chatted for a while. When she was about to leave, she secretly opened the blanket wrapped around the baby, then grabbed the tiny foot to examine it. After seeing something, she immediately dropped the baby and screamed. Luckily, she had been sitting on a chair, and the child was wrapped in thick layers of cloth, so he was not hurt. He was only startled and began crying loudly. Sarah rushed over to pick up her child, while Daniel gave Mrs. Harper an annoyed look. The old woman ran into the yard and shouted loudly, pointing a trembling finger toward Thomas's house, crying that this family had given birth to a returning child spirit and that they had to get rid of it immediately, or the whole village would be infected by its evil aura. Hearing Mrs. Harper shouting, the surrounding neighbors all rushed out to watch. Everyone there knew the legend of Demon Mason and the curse of extinction he had left on the village. The curse of the returning child spirit had made countless families miserable. People said families struck by that curse were haunted by demons and watched by ghosts. And because of that, everyone feared them and wanted to stay far away from any household suffering such disaster. No one wanted their own family to be affected. Sarah carried the crying baby into the room, Thomas and Daniel rushed into the yard, intending to confront Mrs. Harper face to face. No one could be happy when the child, born from their own flesh and blood, was accused of being a returning child spirit. Thomas shouted, returned the pig's leg to Mrs. Harper, and drove her away. But Mrs. Harper was not easy to deal with. She screamed even louder, and more people gathered to watch. Curious neighbors did not yet understand the full story, so they dared not judge carelessly. They demanded that Mrs. Harper show proof and warned her not to make false accusations. They knew the ending for families accused of having a returning child spirit was tragic. Mrs. Harper, who had been sitting at the gate, heard the villagers demand evidence, brushed off her pants, stood up, and ran straight into Thomas's house. Sarah was in the middle of changing the baby's cloth when Mrs. Harper pushed her aside. Sarah was caught off guard and nearly fell. The old woman took the chance to carry the child out into the yard while Sarah called after her. Trying to get her baby back, Mrs. Harper held the child before the porch, opened the layers of cloth, and showed the baby's tiny foot to everyone. In the middle of the baby's rosy right sole was a black birthmark the size of a finger joint. Mrs. Harper pointed at the mark and declared clearly that everyone had to believe her. She said the black mark was not natural. When Thomas's second grandson had died, she had suspected that the family was cursed by a returning child spirit. So she secretly smeared soot on the sole of that child's foot to see whether the next child would have the mark. Now everyone could see it clearly. She asked how she could have known where the mark would be if she had not made it herself. She insisted the child was definitely a returning child spirit. Now they had to follow village custom and cut away that spirit, or else it would spread to other households. If Thomas's family refused, it meant they were opposing the village. People moved closer to look carefully. Indeed, there was a long black mark on the child's sole. The villagers were familiar with this kind of marking. They whispered noisily among themselves, and in the end, the crowd leaned completely toward Mrs. Harper. They shouted that Thomas's family had to get rid of the baby. Thomas felt his head ache from hearing hundreds of mouths talking at once. Sarah rushed out and snatched her poor child back, tears covering her face. She held the baby tightly in her arms. Daniel did not believe Mrs. Harper's baseless words, and even if they were true, he was determined not to let them harm his wife and child. Daniel stood in front of Sarah to protect her. Mrs. Harper and the villagers still insisted that the child be handed over. The baby in the bundle cried sharply, his tiny body squirming continuously. Sarah cried like rain. She knew what those people wanted to do to her child. Just thinking about what they intended to do to a newborn made her whole body turn cold, even if it cost her life. Sarah was determined to protect her child. When Sarah was 10 years old, she had once witnessed a family with a returning child spirit. It was the family of Sarah's cousin, who was 10 years older than her. That year, her cousin was 20 and had already given birth 3 times, but all the children had died. Her husband's family was small. After the cousin became pregnant with her 3rd child, her husband volunteered for war and died, leaving only the cousin and her mother-in-law to depend on one another. The mother-in-law was a harsh and bitter woman. Her son had sacrificed himself for the nation's independence, but she always blamed the daughter-in-law for bringing death to him and cursed her with cruel words. The cousin's first two children both died before reaching 2 months old. Infant illness was common. But for some reason, those two children became so sick that they died. No one knew who told the mother-in-law to use black ink to mark the forehead of the second grandchild before burying the baby. When the third child was born, the cousin nearly died from the difficult labor. Just after waking, she saw that her newborn child was being held tightly by her mother-in-law. With many people gathered around, the mother-in-law pointed at the newborn's forehead, where there was a black birthmark in the same place she had marked the second child before burial. She said her daughter-in-law had given birth to a returning child spirit and that the curse had to be cut away or the whole area would be affected. At that time, the cousin did not know how the curse was cut. She thought they only needed to perform a simple ritual. Exhausted from childbirth, she handed the matter over to her mother-in-law to handle. Who would have thought that the woman had no pity at all for her red-skinned newborn grandchild? She immediately found people to conduct the ritual. The cousin's mother-in-law invited the midwife over. After the prayers were finished, she handed the midwife a bamboo strip sharpened on one side. The midwife used that bamboo strip to cut a long line across the mother-in-law's wrist. The bamboo sliced cleanly, and blood immediately flowed onto it. The baby was placed naked in the cradle, his black eyes blinking continuously. A crowd gathered around to look at the soft, weak body of the newborn. But they did not dare come too close or touch the child, fearing the evil aura would spread to them. The baby lay there until he grew weak from hunger and cried for milk. Sarah's cousin was exhausted, but hearing her baby cry broke her heart, so she forced herself to sit up, intending to feed him first and then let them continue the ritual. But when she reached the porch, she saw the midwife holding the sharp bamboo strip stained with her mother-in-law's fresh blood, bringing it toward the cradle. Sensing danger, the instinct of a mother drove the cousin to use all her strength to shove the midwife away, but several men stopped her. Sarah's cousin was not originally from that village. Because of war and evacuation, she had come there, married, and become a daughter-in-law. She had never known about the custom of cutting the returning child's spirit. She was pressed to the ground, her miserable eyes fixed on her poor baby. Apart from crying and screaming, she could do nothing. She cried and begged until she fainted, while the sound of her baby's cries still rang in her ears like something tearing through her heart and guts. The baby was held down by the midwife, who used the bamboo strip to cut across the middle of his navel. When bamboo was sharpened properly, it could be sharper than a knife. She made one decisive stroke, and the baby's tender flesh immediately split open, blood pouring out. The people watching frowned and did not dare look, but none of them intended to help the pitiful child. The grandmother stared as her poor grandchild was tortured, indifferent as if nothing were happening. Her face was cold as money. A few malicious people nearby pointed and whispered cruel words into her ear, saying that those returning child spirits were the unlucky things that had killed her son. She heard those absurd words and believed them. The more she thought about it, the more she nodded, thinking they were right. And so she hated both her daughter-in-law and her grandchild even more. She watched her own grandchild scream as each cut tore into his body without a trace of pity. The baby's abdomen was completely cut open, and blood soaked the cradle before dripping to the ground in a pool. The baby also fainted from pain. The midwife's hands trembled, but she had no choice. Because village custom was like that. If a returning child spirit was discovered, the child's body had to be split in half, then buried in two different places, one part on the mountain and one part near a river or lake. Only then could the curse be severed. It had been that way for many years, so no matter how pitiful the baby was, he could not escape the village custom. His tiny body, not even 3 kilograms, was split in two by elders who had lived long lives but possessed cruel hearts. His skin was thin as a paper, and the blood vessels beneath it could still be seen. His body was as soft as tofu, and very quickly everything was finished. His organs still held warmth. The baby died while hungry for milk, and he had been killed by his own grandmother. When Sarah's cousin woke up, everything was already over and could no longer be changed. The two halves of her poor child's body had been placed into 2 separate earthen jars, ready to be carried away for burial. The mother who had lost her child did not yet understand what had happened. She knelt and begged her mother-in-law to let her see her baby. The mother-in-law acted annoyed and lifted her chin toward the 2 clay jars. At that time, the ritual items had not been fully prepared. They still lacked chrysanthemums and 2 halves of a red talisman, so the lids of the jars were still open. The smell of fresh blood drifted through the air, attracting flies. Sarah's cousin rushed over. But when she saw what was inside, she screamed like a madwoman. Inside the 2 clay jars were the 2 bloody halves of her child's body. The baby's skin was pale green from losing so much blood, and the flesh, bones, and organs had been cut apart clumsily. Just looking at it was heartbreaking. No mother could endure such a shock. The cousin lost her reason, rushed into the kitchen, grabbed a chopping knife, and struck at the midwife who had killed her child. That blow did not kill the woman, but it nearly severed her right arm. Blood and flesh mixed together, the arm hanging by a strip in a horrifying scene. The midwife rolled on the ground, suffering the unbearable pain of the nearly severed limb. Sarah's cousin, as if completely insane, lunged toward the killer without hesitation. No one dared stop her. With another slash, one of the midwife's ears was cut off. The woman turned pale with fear and fainted on the spot. Sarah's cousin's worn clothes were soaked entirely with fresh blood. In despair, she dragged the knife along. Whoever came near, she slashed. Anyone who failed to run away fast enough would have their flesh cut open. People scattered in panic. Yet during the chaos, the mother-in-law grabbed the 2 jars containing the body and escaped. Sarah's cousin, now mad, chased her mother-in-law all the way to the riverbank, but the old woman managed to flee. The person the cousin most wanted to kill was that woman, but heaven perhaps did not yet want such a cold-blooded, wicked person to die. The cousin then wandered to the riverbank and threw herself into the water, hoping to reunite with her children. The lake water flowed straight into the river, and her body disappeared completely. From that day on, Sarah's relatives searched for a whole month, but found nothing, and eventually they had to give up. After the death of that miserable daughter-in-law, the mother-in-law continued living comfortably and leisurely for a while longer, without the slightest guilt or remorse. Her daughter-in-law had died and vanished, yet she did not bother searching. Instead, she cursed and insulted the dead woman. Later, after being without a husband for a long time, the mother-in-law began craving the company of men. She slept with one man after another and unexpectedly became pregnant. By then, she was nearly 50. The villagers cursed her as shameless, while her belly continued to grow larger for unknown reasons. She had to live under the insults and gossip of the village. Even she herself had not expected to become pregnant at that age. When her daughter-in-law had still been alive, even with a belly huge from pregnancy, she had been forced by the old woman to do heavy labor. Now the old woman was old, and there was no one left in the house. She did not even know who the father of the child in her belly was. All the food she had stored was consumed while she sat idle. By the time she was close to giving birth, her belly was enormous, and there was nothing edible left in the house. Shamelessly, she went to the neighbors begging for food, but no one gave her any. Beyond matters of morality and reputation, in those hungry times, a single meal could keep an entire family alive. No one had extra to give to an outsider. The mother-in-law went hungry for several days, and in the end, she collapsed from exhaustion. While sleeping, she dreamed of her dead daughter-in-law returning to claim her life. She was awakened by the nightmare, and just as she opened her eyes, pain began tearing through her belly. The child inside thrashed violently, like a snake slithering back and forth. She shouted for help, but for some reason, no one heard her. Or perhaps some people did hear, but did not want to save her. In the end, she hemorrhaged. The child died in her womb before being born, and both mother and child died together before she breathed her last, because the pain had tormented her to the extreme. The mother-in-law died with her eyes open, mouth gaping, eyes rolled back white. By the time someone found her, her body had long gone stiff. Everyone thought she had died from a difficult birth, so they buried her body on the mountain. Unexpectedly, a few days later, a heavy rain came. The burial place had not yet settled, so it collapsed. Her corpse was swept away by earth and stones, then eaten clean by wild animals on the mountain. Thinking of the custom of cutting the returning child's spirit made Sarah shudder. She could not stand by and watch her child die like that. In terror, Sarah knelt and repeatedly begged the villagers to spare her child. Of course, the villagers did not listen. They feared being affected and were willing to sacrifice Sarah's child, even though they did not truly know whether doing so could cut away the evil spirit or not. Trembling, Sarah held her child and tried to run, but Mrs. Harper blocked her. The old woman glared and slapped Sarah across the face several times. Mrs. Harper herself had once given birth to returning child spirits, and because of that, she had watched with her own eyes as people split her children's bodies apart and buried them. From that day on, she never gave birth to another child. Having endured the terrible pain of losing children, she did not want to see others happy. She wanted everyone to suffer the same pain as her. The baby in Sarah's arms cried sharply, his face turning purple as he struggled to breathe. Thomas and Daniel were surrounded and held tightly by several men. They tied the father and son up and locked them in a room, while Sarah was beaten until she fainted. Mrs. Harper took the baby back and looked at him with extreme disgust. Even though the child was crying himself hoarse, she quickly called the midwife who had delivered Sarah's baby and gathered the villagers, intending to split the child's body in half. She placed Sarah's baby on a wooden table lined with cloth. The neighbors called out and assigned tasks to one another. When everything was ready, the midwife walked over and grabbed Sarah's thin, bony arm, cutting into it. People believed they had to follow the example of the ancient spiritual master, using a family member's blood to coat the bamboo strip. Only then could they cut away the returning child spirit. Dark red blood flowed down Sarah's arm. The midwife quickly rubbed the bamboo strip through the blood several times, staining it bright red. She carried the bamboo strip over to where the baby lay. A drop of blood fell. The midwife used that blood to rub the black birthmark under the baby's foot. Fortunately, just as the sharp bamboo strip was about to tear into the baby's belly, Daniel and Thomas broke free and rushed forward to seize the child back. Daniel saw his wife's arm covered in blood and shouted in fury. Thomas quickly held the grandchild, who was crying until his face turned purple, and hid him against his chest protectively. The people around surged forward again, intending to pull Thomas and Daniel away to seize the child, ready to use force against the family that had resisted. While the crowd was struggling fiercely, a tall man approached. His body was lean, his voice deep, his sparse beard grown long, and his eyes looked sharp and intelligent. The unfamiliar man pushed into the middle and shouted loudly for everyone to be quiet. He introduced himself as the new village chief, who had arrived only 3 days earlier. Hearing that there was chaos at Thomas's house, he had rushed over to see the situation. Mrs. Harper told him that Thomas's family had a returning child spirit. The new village chief was a man who knew right from wrong, so he spoke in defense of the newborn. He said he knew a spiritual master from Louisiana who was very skilled at resolving lingering death curses, and that this problem of returning child spirits might be solved. The village chief intended to invite that master to come and examine the matter. Seeing the villagers still making noise, the chief promised everyone that if he could not resolve it, he would not dare accept the position of village chief anymore. Only then did the people temporarily believe him. This new village chief had witnessed the phenomenon of returning child spirits before. He knew there was a simple way to handle it without using cruel customs that took lives. He told Thomas's family to raise the child in peace. If the baby survived the first 3 months, that would be good. if he still died young like the previous two. They would invite the Louisiana master to come and resolve it. The immediate danger was removed, but Sarah still could not keep this child. She was terrified that when her child died, people would come and split his body in half. That horror haunted even her shallow, restless sleep. The 3-month deadline arrived. Once again, the little child peacefully passed away during an afternoon nap. Sarah saw him breathe rapidly a few times, then slowly stop breathing. His tiny hand gradually grew cold in her hand. The young mother once again endured the pain of losing a child. Thomas silently wiped away tears and went to find the village chief to ask what to do. The neighbors heard the news and crowded the yard, curious to see what the village chief would do with the baby. The chief arrived with a man wearing an old, worn gray robe. The man introduced himself as a spiritual practitioner who, by coincidence, had just come to the area the previous night and now happened to be able to help Thomas's family. The practitioner performed a ritual of release at the house for the dead child, then told Thomas's family to follow him to a large monastery more than 50 kilometers from the village. The journey was long, but no one felt tired. Their hearts were heavy with grief and worry. There, the practitioner helped Thomas's family send the child's soul to the monastery. Afterward, they prepared the body, placed it in a small ceramic coffin, and buried it on the hill behind the monastery. The practitioner burned 3 substitute paper figures and warned Thomas's family that when praying or making offerings at home, they must not call the names of the 3 grandchildren who had died. Otherwise, the children would not stay at the monastery to cultivate peace, but would return again to be reborn into the family. Thomas, Daniel, and Sarah thanked him repeatedly. They did not yet know whether this method would work, but as long as the child's body was not cut in half, they were deeply grateful. People in the village still gossiped, but Thomas's family ignored them. 100 days after the 3rd child died, Sarah once again dreamed that she was walking to the old oak tree at the village entrance. Again, she saw a dead baby abandoned beneath the tree. Sarah was about to walk over and pick the baby up, but suddenly, beside her ear, she heard a child's soft voice saying, "Mother, please don't carry him. Go home quickly. Your child is waiting for you at home," half believing and half doubting. Sarah heard the voice and felt as if she had been guided. She turned around and went home instead of approaching the dead child. She did not know whose voice it was, but it had called her mother. Only then did Sarah sense that the earlier dream of carrying the dead baby was connected to her giving birth to returning child spirits. For the next 3 years, Sarah did not become pregnant again. The family of 3 thought they had lost all hope. But fortunately, on a beautiful day, Sarah once again became a mother. This time, her health during pregnancy was very good. Although she had morning sickness, it lasted only during the first 3 months and then stopped. In the later months, Sarah could eat and sleep, so her health remained stable. When the baby reached full term, he was born. The 4th child was still a boy. But there was no mark anywhere on his body. Sarah raised him day by day with constant fear and unease. Then heaven truly took pity on their family. The baby was completely healthy and normal, strong and lively. At 3 months, he could already roll over, cried little, and smiled often. The whole family was overjoyed. When the boy was nearly 3 years old, Sarah became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to twin daughters. The family was filled with happiness. 3 children had brought warmth back into a house that had once been cold and sorrowful. The children grew up healthy in the love and protection of their grandfather and parents. When the people in the village learned that the returning child's spirit could be resolved gently, they were very happy. From then on, whenever any family was struck by the returning child's spirit, they brought the child to the monastery so the spirit could listen to scripture and cultivate toward a new life. Everything returned to its original starting point, and the cruel custom of cutting the returning child's spirit, which had been passed down for generations, was finally buried forever.